So today we have a 2009 Dodge Ram 1500 5.7 Hemi. Has a noise from the right front wheel, like a crunching noise coming from the wheel bearing area, so we're going to have a look at that. So having a look at this front wheel bearing, I think you can see that there's a bit of play in it. But I also noticed a couple other problems. So looking through the left front wheel here, if you look at this inner shaft here, how much it moves on that stub shaft. So this inner joint is worn out, the stub shaft is worn out. So we're going to have to change the axle, CV axle, the intermediate shaft in here. This seal is leaking, and the wheel bearing. So once you get the wheel off, we're going to start by removing this ABS brake sensor connector, the clip here, as well as the clip here. Remove the caliper assembly. We don't need to take the brake caliper off the bracket, so we're going to take the entire brake caliper off and tie it up so that it's not hanging. And then we'll proceed to remove the rotor and the front wheel bearing. So as I said before, you can take the caliper assembly off and hang it from the frame. Don't let it hang by the brake hose. Take the rotor off, and now we'll remove the axle nut. So the axle socket is a 36 millimeter, and you should be able to remove it with an impact gun. And the axle shaft pushes inboard, so that's good. Next, to remove the 3 bolts that hold the wheel bearing in from the back. Spray some penetrating fluid around the joint here where the axle wheel bearing attaches. So we have to disconnect this upper ball joint and possibly even the lower one. I'm going to try to tilt the upper one out. So I've removed the rust from the threads, and we're going to remove this upper nut. Looks like 13/16. So even though I cleaned the rust off there a bit, I want to try to get that nut off to the end of the threads here before I break that upper ball joint loose in the taper. Otherwise it'll be very difficult to hold it. So I'm working it back and forth with penetrating fluid on it. Now, I checked the upper and lower ball joints and they seem to be good. So we don't want to damage this seal when we take this off. Well, the last couple of threads and the stud broke itself loose in the taper here. Normally I would just strike this a couple of times with a ball peen hammer and the shock will pull it off or break it loose. You don't want to use a pickle fork in here because you'll damage this ball joint seal. This truck has a leveling kit in it, which puts much more stress and strain on the CV joints and the axle joint. Even though it's only raised like 1.5 inches, it makes the working angles on the CV shaft much greater than the original design was. So I've elected to remove the tie rod end and the lower ball joint, take the whole knuckle off. It's hard to get those 3 bolts. If I was just changing the wheel bearing, I would attempt it, but we got to change the axle shaft. You got to undo the lower ball joint. So we just got 1 tie rod end. So I'm using this tie rod puller here instead of a pickle fork to take this tie rod off. Okay, so now that the steering knuckle is out of the way, the lower ball joint is disconnected, we're going to use a blunt object and blunt force trauma to knock this outer shaft or inner joint away from the intermediate shaft here. So we'll see how that works out. Let's see how this works. I'm going to use this and this hammer. No, it's not coming off. That's typical. Alright, well, we'll take it out with the intermediate shaft bearing retainer assembly so we don't break something in there. So there's the shaft out. It just slides out once you knock this seal retainer out. Now the problem is I need to get this seal retainer out of here because the new seal, which is just a seal, will be pressed into this bearing retainer. Now you can buy this seal with this retainer right from the dealer, but it's about $100 as opposed to $20–25 for the seal. So I'm going to use a Sawzall to cut the shaft off so I can get this off. And there's a little bit of wear on the end of this. There's a needle bearing inside there. We're going to have a look in there and see what that looks like. And of course the CV shaft is going to be replaced as an assembly. The outer boot has a tear in it as well. But the main problem is that this is worn in here, as you can see. Again, with that leveling kit in the front suspension, it puts a lot more stress on this small little spline here, which only goes in about 1¼ inch. Nevertheless, we'll carry on. So it turns out that shaft is way harder steel than I anticipated, so cutting it with a hacksaw blade was not an option. I realized though that this gear is held on with a snap ring here, and the gear actually comes off pretty easy. Now I'm hoping that I can just pull this bearing off and then take the seal off the other way. So we'll see how that goes. Well, in hindsight, it would have been probably better off just to buy this whole bearing retainer, because now I have to straighten it out. But if you cut that cage off the bearing, you can pull the seal out over the top. You're changing this inner seal anyway, so now it's just a matter of reversing the procedure to reassemble it. Yeah, I gotta clean up this bearing retainer. So there's the bearing retainer cleaned up. I'll put some sealant on it when I put it in. Now we have to press this seal in here. As I said, this seal comes from the factory as a complete assembly. We replace this as an assembly. The aftermarket sells just this seal. I think if you're doing this job, spend the extra money and go straight to the dealer and buy the seal. I'm going to put some Loctite on that because that seal's not very tight in there. It does have a Teflon seal on it. So there's a seal installed in the retainer. I straightened out the ears on the retainer. We're going to put some sealant on the back of this when it's pressed in, and we're ready to reassemble the diff. So there's the differential housing cleaned off. Gasket surface clean. We're going to have to double check the differential fluid when we put it back in. I've looked at that bearing inside there. It looks pretty decent. I'm going to put a little bit of chassis grease on that bearing and slip the shaft in. So there's the shaft installed. I pre-lubricated this bearing with some Royal Purple synthetic gear oil and a little bit of grease on the needle bearing inside there, but again, we're going to double check the diff fluid when we put it back in. So we're ready to install that seal now. It's actually pressed in there, so what you have to do, and I put some RTV sealant on the back side of it, is you have to start it over top of the housing shaft. There it goes like that. And then put 2 bolts in to line it up. There's only 2 bolts. I remember the first time I did one of these, I thought the bolts were broken off in there. So make sure it's lined up. And then we're going to tap that in place. Get a hammer here. Okay, now that I know the holes are lined up, I'm going to use a socket of some kind to tap it in the rest of the way. Okay, so I got the bolt holes lined up. We've got a axle socket here. That should be good. Put the bolts in and check the diff fluid. So I'm installing the axle shaft. I put never sees on the splines, and I put the old axle nut on the end of the axle shaft. I'm holding the axle shaft straight, and I'm using a fairly big hammer to Make sure it's on all the way. Yeah, looks like it is. Yeah. Now we're ready to change the wheel bearing. So the wheel bearing is considerably easier to change now with this. So I can take these out with an impact gun and knock the wheel bearing out, clean up the knuckle assembly, install a new wheel bearing, and reassemble it onto the vehicle. So I'm having difficulty getting this bearing assembly out of here. So I've installed 3 donor bolts. They're actually Chevy ones. And I've got it clamped in the vise, and I'm going to use a fairly big hammer on these bolts to see if I can get it to budge. I was hitting on here, but had no way to secure it. So that worked. I got it out. Now I just got to get these bolts out now that I've probably damaged the threads on them. There's one. Yeah, I'll get them out. So we need to clean up this oxidized aluminum as well as the backing plate here, and reinstall all of this with a new bearing. There are 2 different bearings depending on what year or what build date this is in this model year, so I'll have to compare them to see which one I got them both. So there's the knuckle cleaned up. I used a Rolox sanding disc and a air chisel to chisel off the corrosion, and a die grinder and an angle bit to clean out the inside of this bore. So we're ready to reinstall the bearing. So here's the conundrum. There are 2 wheel bearings, the 930808 and the 930690. I can't remember which one is before a certain date and which one's after a certain date, but I couldn't read the date the vehicle was manufactured on the truck because the tag is missing. Now comparing these wheel bearings, they look identical. Same bolt pattern, same connector, but obviously something is different. The wheel speed sensor harness maybe is different, but it looks the same. The axle shaft spline is the same, the depth is the same, so I'm going to have to try and get a hold of the dealer and see if I can find out which bearing this is supposed to take. So here is the parts catalog. The 930690 is up to 12708. Now is that July the 8th or the 7th of August? Or after 12808. Now as I said, I can't read the sticker on the door because it's missing, and I can't for the life of me see what's different in these 2 wheel bearings. So call to the dealer. So here's a Napa parts catalog. It lists both the same bearings, but it doesn't even tell you what the difference is. There's got to be something that's obviously different between these 2 bearings. I clicked on this one here. Well, we'll compare this. Well, after discussing this with the parts guys and calling the dealer, it appears that the OEM number crosses to this 808 number. What the difference is, I have no clue. I thought maybe if I went on the SKF site it would tell me, but it says the 960 is rear-wheel drive Mexico through December 2012 708, and then the 808 is after that, rear-wheel drive Mexico. The description is exactly the same. So it's frustrating. I mean, if somebody put a used steering knuckle on this thing, they could easily buy the wrong assembly, and I don't know what the difference is. I can't see anything physically different between those 2 wheel bearings. Oh well, we're going to go with the 808 because that's what the dealer says it takes. So the 3 bolts that hold the wheel bearing into the knuckle are torqued to 120 foot-pounds or 163 Newton meters. I got to look for the axle nut torque too as well, but we'll find that once we get the steering knuckle installed. Okay, so there's the caliper back on. Let's start here. Torque on this axle nut is 185 foot-pounds. Torque on the bracket that holds the brake caliper on is 130 foot-pounds. Upper ball joint, unique procedure here, 45 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees, which is roughly a quarter turn. Lower ball joint, 38 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees. Sorry, the upper was 40 foot-pounds plus 200 degrees, which is just over half a turn. Lower was 38 foot-pounds and 90 degrees, and this outer tie rod end, which I still have to put on, is 45 foot-pounds and a quarter turn or 90 degrees. And we're ready to put the wheel back on.